Welcome back to the Fuel Your Legacy podcast. Each week, we expose the faulty foundational mindsets of the past and rebuild a newer, stronger foundation essential in creating your meaningful legacy. We've got a lot of work to do, so let's get started. As much as you like this podcast, I'm certain that you're going to love the book that I just released on Amazon, Fuel Your Legacy, The 9 Pillars to Build a Meaningful Legacy. I wrote this to share with you the experiences that I had while I was identifying my identity, how I began to create my meaningful legacy, and how you can create yours. You're going to find this book on Kindle, Amazon, and as always on my website, samknickerbocker.com.
Love pets, but hate the heartbreak of overpopulation? The Animal Alliance is here to help. Our spay and neuter programs aim to reduce the number of homeless pets. Visit theanimalalliance.org to support our compassionate mission.
Welcome back to the Fuel Your Legacy show. And today I'm very, very excited to have this interview. I know very little about this topic. I saw the opportunity to have this conversation and I jumped on it because I love learning new things. Like, one of my objectives in life is just to have as many conversations with as many different people as I can. And Jeff fits in that category. What he does is unique. His perspective is unique. And we were talking a little bit before, and he said, I'm basically, if you remember the movie Moneyball, I kind of did the Moneyball strategy that they did for baseball. He did it with horse racing. I was like, that's such a random thing to do this with. But I'm excited for it. So his name is Jeff Seder, and his call sign, if you call it in the racing world, is Dogzilla. And so if you're from the horse racing world, maybe you know him from there. But I'm going to turn the time over to him. I'm going to be taking notes, but I just want to know what his experience was. So go for it, Jeff. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I guess I'm going to start with how I got into it and why I do it. But before I do, I just want to briefly say, that we were preceded the Moneyball like 20 years. And we can talk about how you can get into horse racing at any level, small or big. We've done both. If you want to buy a professional sports team like the NFL or the NBA, you may spend $2 billion. But in horse racing, you can have a professional team and all the social life and all the action and everything else for like $20 million. Or you can have a racehorse for $40,000. Although that's a lot riskier than having a stable. Anyway, that's what we do. We develop technology. We were the originals in our industry. Almost nobody else does it because it costs so much and took so long to build huge databases, whole new technologies and patents. On our website, you can actually not only see our track record that we've had world champions galore, but that you can download actually copies of published papers on our technologies that we developed that were published in refereed major veterinary scientific journals. So how the hell did I get into this? I was a suburban kid growing up and I loved animals. I had dogs. I used to sit and stare at squirrels. And I went to Harvard, and I was in the top 1% of my class, but I wasn't real happy. I was pre-med, so I had a lot of science. And then I went to the Peace Corps project for a couple of years in Africa. And I came back, and I went to law school and business school because I wanted to be what I call now an entrepreneur for the horses. Uh-huh. And they didn't have a joint program then, so I applied to both and got in both. That tells you what type A I was. And then I was just kind of really not I just was drifting. And I went on a blind date to a riding stable to rent horses and ride with this girl. And on a day in May when I was 27, and instead of falling in love with the girl, I fell in love with the horse. And I ended up taking lessons and buying a horse and moving out to the country and going crazy on it. And then my thesis for law and business schools combined was supposed to be, some business legal issues. So my advisor was Archibald Cox. You may remember him at Harvard from the Midnight Massacre with Nixon, but everybody resigned. Nixon ended up resigning. He was the special prosecutor. Anyway, he had his office like they do in Harvard in the stacks, way back and somewhere deep in the library thing with the little desk surrounded by books everywhere and shelves. And I went in to see him, and it was like March of my senior year. I hadn't done shit on a thesis. So he kind of said, well, how's it going? And I kind of looked down. He figured out what was going on. He said, well, what are you interested in? And he didn't throw me out. I thought, this is going to be bad. And I kind of looked at the floor again, and I said, horses. And then I looked down at the floor again. I thought, I'm done. And he turned around. He took this big book out from behind him, and he drops it on the desk, and the dust goes up. And he says, this is the statute that governs horse racing in Massachusetts. And no one here has ever looked at it. Why don't you do that? And so I went crazy with it. I went down to the Capitol Archives, and I dug up shit on the racetrack there in Boston. They had all kinds of fancy footwear trying to look like they were broke while they were funneling the money up to the parent company, and all kinds of other shit. Read everything I could get a hold of, and I got an A, and I loved it, but I couldn't figure out how the hell. By then, I'm hooked on what can I do to be with horses? I'm too big to be a jockey. I was a good athlete. I made the Olympic trials in wrestling, but I was too big to be a jockey. I didn't know anybody in horse racing. I didn't know shit. I didn't have any money. And I thought, this is hopeless. But I know I can bring modern management and scientific stuff to an industry which is all eyeball and intuition, done the way it was for 300 years. And I could do that. I didn't know how hard it would be or how much it would cost. I wouldn't have tried, because I ended up like starving to death for 20 years. I tell people it was easy. It only took 35 years and several $1 million of private research to be an overnight success and start having a great track record in world champions. Anyway, so then I started doing it. I early on, I linked up. It was, I think I told you this, but 1976, the East Germans burst on the scene. They were winning everything in the Olympics. And a tiny little country all of a sudden, it used to be a Russian and United States competition for medals, and now all of a sudden they were there. Everybody said, how are they doing it? And the answer was mad scientists working in kindergartens. So there was a panic. So anyway, as a young lawyer, I got involved with that, and I learned a lot about sports medicine. And I learned that the difference between elite athletes and normal was as big as between normal and injured or sick. And you can't go the data of what's average or normal. It's useless. You have to build databases on these elite athletes. And so I started to do that on racehorses, and I got to work with some of the greatest trainers. And by accident, I got hooked up with one of the first lady jockeys in the United States. She lied about her age at 15 and rode in West Virginia. And she was also a trainer. And I got hooked up. She came to break a yearling I had bought. And she was interested in what I was doing. And she was connected to the top trainers in the United States, including the guy who had Seattle Slew won the Triple Crown. And I say now that I look at the altimeter, and she looks out the window to see if we're off the ground. And it's that combination of me and her that made it work. It was the traditional expertise with an overlay of tech. If you don't have the basics, if you're not really good at the basics, the tech's really worthless. You're just an egghead screwing around. But if you can actually have the best of what there was and then overlay some stuff on that's really useful, that was a big deal. And we did it with high-speed filming and digitizing and ultrasound, the inner organs of the horses, heart rate meters, and all kinds of testing. I could tell great stories about how that went. But mostly it was a disaster in the beginning, but it's not anymore. I don't know. Maybe something in there. Now there's patents and all kinds of stuff.
This is great.
Oh, by the way, there's very few. A couple of guys tried to imitate us, but it's mostly ridiculous. They don't have the databases. They didn't have the money. It's like giving them. We published stuff, but it was like giving them a violin and an instruction manual. They couldn't play a symphony. It's just silly.
Yeah. What's fascinating about that is the idea of how industries change, and
we've been copied a lot.
Yeah, copied is great, but if the copying, I think of, there's copying and then there's faxing, right? And faxing, everything gets all jumbled up, things don't come out properly. But copying is almost a better scenario than a fax, where you're missing data. The data gets
mostly fact. Mostly they did it without the data, and then it wouldn't work, and then they'd say, "See, he's full of junk." except that my track record just got better and better.
Right. And so they don't have the stuff, they don't have the level data to disprove.
Or they would get so excited about one technology that they finally figured out was important. And then they would base everything on that. And that's, you can't, the elite athletes are a whole package. There's a whole series of things that have to be right. If you get one of them as the best there is, it doesn't mean squat unless the rest of it's there.
Right. So let's just talk about that for a second. When you're talking about like the ability to, when you say Moneyball, even though Moneyball is the more contemporary or more recent version of this, as you're building this database, you're analyzing every aspect of the horses. How much of it was from a perspective of benefiting the jockey so they understood the horse better, or is it purely just what's the likelihood that this horse is laws of probability, and as much data you can get in laws of probability? And you're on mute, by the way, just so you know.
Is that better?
Yeah, there you go.
So, in the beginning, we didn't know what to go after, but I thought I would adapt it from what was working in the human sports medicine side. Interval training was just beginning, heart rates, VO2 max, measuring gases when people were on treadmills. We did that with the horses in swimming pools and slings with heart rate meters on them. And we would take the gases out from a mask on their face and stuff. And we looked at everything that was going on in the human sports medicine thing, but we found out early that wasn't going to work. And what we had to benchmark, get elite horses and work with them and measure everything we could. I actually followed horses to the paddock before races and measured how much their poop weighed to see if that was a big deal. Because jockeys would fight over an extra pound or two, but they would have a dump that was 15 pounds. So and we found out a whole lot of stuff that doesn't work. We found out that the quadruped locomotion textbooks on the way the horses ran were wrong. We found out the equine cardiologists, the experts, luminaries, the major universities were wrong about the heart rates and the response of the hearts, because we built the first heart rate meter we had to have custom chips made by Hitachi before there were PCs, or we did that. We found out that the lungs in the horses were used to cool them, like panning a dog. And they had massive lung capacities, way beyond what they needed for oxygenating their blood. So there was no point in developing their interval training except to make them dull or have them injured. And it went on and on. So we figured, but meanwhile we were benchmarking these elite athletes that we could get to, especially with the help of these New York trainers that were big time, like Billy Turner. And we learned a lot. We built these huge databases about what would work. And for everything that we found that worked, there were 25 things that didn't. But I can tell you that we basically found out that almost everything that was said in the literature, in the quadruped locomotion, everything was all wrong. Why? Because they never studied elite racehorses. It was all based on ponies on treadmills in a lab somewhere. Or theory, some engineer had a big theory, but he couldn't ride a horse. He never done it. So that was a big deal. I forget what question I was asking.
Well, no, and I think that something you just brought up there is the difference between where did I write it? The difference between a sick horse, I say sick, I don't know if that was your exact word, and a normal horse is the same distance between a normal horse and an elite athlete.
Yeah, or injuries, trauma, illness, sickness, and normal. And then that normal database is no good really without something that's far away from that, which is the hearts, the size of the left ventricle, the thickness of the wall of that left ventricle, the character of that muscle, the spleen, the diameter of their spleens. These things in the elite rate horses, they're not just marginally bigger, they're like 50% bigger. They're different. They're different when they're babies, which brings me back to who was I trying to help them? We found out pretty much that the trainers and the jockeys can screw it up, but they can't make enough of a difference. The whole focus of the thing has to be on what is an elite animal physiologically and neurologically for the gait, because they can run within like 20 minutes of birth. It's not learned. It's a neurological pattern, like a fingerprint.
Find it heartbreaking to see so many homeless pets? The Animal Alliance agrees. That's why we're spaying and neutering to reduce overpopulation out of compassion. Visit theanimalalliance.org to help us save some heartbreak.
And so we found out that was it. We had to find those animals. Then we had to funnel them to the good trainers, and there aren't many. Most of the trainers are like, the racetrack's like a hospital with where all the MDs got their MD from a 2-week correspondence course. Some of them are just fucking geniuses with repositories of 300 years of experience, but most of them are not close to that. So yeah, and if you could send the same horse, I can't tell you how many things there are that can go wrong. So many variables, and any one of them, you won't have an elite horse, even if he's got the makings of the elite, the physically. So then we had to figure that out and figure out who the hell can we give this to that won't screw it up, and what jockeys will understand it. And some of it we could help the jockey. Like there was one very, very good racer, stallion, called Looking at Lucky. He had a very, very long stride. So, and that gave him a big advantage because the number one user of energy is the number of strides per second. So if you can cover the same ground with fewer strides and you're a 1,000-pound animal going 40 miles an hour, it's a big deal. So he could do that. But if they kept him in traffic or on the rail, and he couldn't stretch out without clipping heels or bumping into this, being steered around, so he couldn't use it. So he had a disappointing races, and I finally went and I said, whenever he's in traffic, he's on the rail, you can't use what it is. It's so special. Keep him on the outside. They said, wow, then you have to run further, and you're going to run further than everybody else. I said, it'll be fine. And it was. When he was on the outside, he won the major races. So there's a concrete example of how you can help the jockey and the trainer, but explaining to them what's special about this horse and how to protect it.
So what's your process?
I'll give you one more. This is a good story. When my first customer, he's a guy named Ken Ramsey, who's a real gentleman and a terrific guy, famous in horse racing. He's been the leading owner and the leading breeder, I don't know how many times in the United States. So I went, by the way, in Kentucky, I'm not beloved. All these farms are built on the pedigree of these horses and their inventory, their value. Along comes somebody who says, I don't care. How popular am I, right? So anyway, so this guy went to him and gave him my pitch. And I said, he said, I don't understand all that crap. I got 200 horses. Give me one recommendation. I said, you don't understand. It's not one thing. It's blah. He said, no, make a recommendation. So I spent a week on his farm, and I went in and I made a recommendation. I said, in a month or so, it's one of the most famous, most important races in the world. The Belmont Stakes, third piece of the Triple Crown in New York, 1.5 miles. You have a new stallion, Cadiensis, you're trying to promote. In his first crop, there's a horse named Nolan's cat, named after your son, Nolan, who's now a trainer, and a good one. And I said, I want you to enter him in the Belmont Stakes. And he burst out laughing. He said, he's a maiden. He's never won a race. He's been 4-eyed king. He's nothing. And I said, no, he's not fast, but he never slows down. And the truth of the matter is, in almost every single race in dirt in America, when you see a horse making a big move at the end, he's slowing down. Everybody else is slowing down more. It's all a fatigue curve. You can extrapolate specific to that horse, and you can map it in a logarithmic function, and you can extrapolate it out to see what their time would be for a longer distance. None of the races, hardly any of the races are that far, the 1.5 miles. This is a unique race. I said, so if I could extrapolate out his fatigue curve, his velocity decay, logarithmic fatigue curve, I can tell you that he's competitive in the Belmont Stakes. And then you're going to have, out of the first crop of your stallion, a horse that was right up front in one of the most prestigious multi-million-dollar races in the world. So he did it. He entered the horse. The trainer was furious. And the day before the race, the racing form said, that this one's good and that one's got, and this guy's pedigree can go long and blah, blah, blah. But, and then there's all the jokers and idiots. That was us. They never apologized. So, and we get there and the trainer's telling the press that it's not his fault. It's my fault. It's silly and he knows it, blah, blah, blah. So they come out of the gate, the bell rings, and he's last, and he's trailing the field. And I'm thinking I'm going to hide under the table, right? But I thought, no. Halfway through the race, he starts to pick up horses. And when they get to near the beginning of the stretch, he's flying, and he's passing horses. And by the end of the race, if it had gone another 2 or 3 strides, he'd have won the damn race. So he's third in the Belmont Stakes. So now, instead of a big nothing horse, he's got a classic placed colt in his first crop for his stallion. And to prove it wasn't fluke. He then went to the $1 million Louisiana Super Derby and did it again. So I got hired. That was my breakthrough.
And I think that's that right there is such an important, again, I am coming at this from a perspective of business, psychology, not necessarily sports medicine or horse racing, but what I like about success is that it's true everywhere. Success principles are true everywhere. This is a principle that I think is a success principle, or at least something that I will work on disproving in the remaining of my life. But when someone has a breakaway, they're just slowing down less. I think that a lot of times we don't think about, we hear about momentum. We talk about momentum, talk about it in our relationships. We talk about it in our family. We talk about it in our business. We talk about momentum and the idea of what that is, but do we track it in a bell curve? Or like, what does momentum during the month of your business cycle look like? What does momentum look like in whatever it is you're trying to do, whether it's reading or writing, singing a song? Like, what does a momentum curve look like? And how do you have a more sustained, consistent momentum rather than a bell curve momentum? It's a fascinating concept.
The other thing I discovered was, along the way, I discovered you have to ask, how do you know? Because it turned out everything I was being told as I was making it was wrong. And I've thrown out almost everything I was told because I didn't accept it. I would test it. I'd say, well, how does this work? What is that? And then I would go out and I would do it. And the data didn't support it. Didn't support it on how they breathe it, how they get fitted, on what they're, none of it supported it. But so I just said, okay, I'll just measure everything. And that thing about they all slow down, that was heresy. And, they had to have the right pedigree for distance. I said, no, you don't. You need the right logarithmic fatigue curve. Velocity decay curve. That's what you need for distance. And it doesn't matter what their pedigree is. It comes in all forms.
So how do you, you mentioned this guy's got 200 horses or however many horses he has. How much of your initial, before you go in and make a recommendation to find a horse and back a horse, how many horses do you have to inspect, check, observe, whatever, run the data over? How many do you have to go through from birth before you find like, hey, I've got a winner? Like, what's your odds? Is it 100-1 as a winner? Is it 10-1? Every 10 horses you find somebody who has the potential. I know that, like you mentioned, well, you got to get the right jockey, the right trainer. Like, there's obviously things that have to be done after, just like
I'll tell you the odds. The Kentucky Derby, there's like 20,000 horses born a year. The Kentucky Derby, you can only be in once when you're 3 years old. The best 20 horses, they get points along the way for winning this and that. The best 20 horses qualify. So your chances are 20 out of 20,000. Okay, 1 in 1,000. And when I go to
really quick, is that actually the odds of how many horses you would need to inspect? Or is that based off the old, like I say, the old way? Obviously, you've been doing this a long time.
Well, see, that's the thing. Yes, it is. These guys, they go to an auction. There's 1,200 horses in the catalog. So they have their pedigree expert go over it, and he picks out 20. And then they'll only look at those 20 because there's too many. But at the yearling sale, there may be 5,000, right? And they'll say, well, we're only going to look at, 20 a day. And our pedigree expert will tell us who to look at. I don't do that because I'm looking, I tell them, listen, pedigree is not silly, but it's not strong enough predictor. If you can tell me that it's very unlikely that you'll throw snake eyes 3 times in a row, but you can't tell me it never happens. And so you can't tell me that there's horses with pedigrees you think are crap that aren't good because everybody knows there are. There was a $40,000 horse won the Kentucky Derby this year. I said, and I want to find those. If I just go after all the no-brainers that are great, big, beautiful, fast horses with perfect pedigrees, actually, I would do worse, but some of them are really great. Not all of them. Most of them aren't great, but if you buy 10 of them, you'll have a couple of great ones, and those are the only ones you'll tell people about. But I don't do that. Most of my clients don't want to spend that money. Although I had one guy, he spent $40 million and he ended up with $64 million, but that was unusual. Anyway, so I go to a race auction where there are 1,200 horses in the auction. Almost everybody else may be looking at 20 to 50 horses. I'm looking at them all. I am looking at them all. It costs me more time, more money. I have to have a crew. I have one thing or another. Of course, I only have to have them fail one test and they're out.
What type of
analysis?
What type of analysis? Like, let's say you have 1,200 horses, yes, they only have to fail one of these things. How many of them can you see are going to fail just based off of naked eye observation versus going under the test?
Well, I don't do the naked eye. They all say, oh, I can see it. I can see it. And I'm thinking, no, you can't. If you could see everything that I see by using 500 pictures a second and then digitizing it, you would not have spent $300,000 all the time on horses that are obviously going to break their leg and do awful things, and have short. So that's bullshit. It's not possible to see what I do. It happens too fast for the human eye to see. That's number one. So what I do is at the 2-year-old, so I set up this camera that goes 500 pictures a second. And then I sit there, and when the horse runs by with his jockey, it's like a minute or two before the next one comes. And then I loop it, and I watch it at 1/10 the speed. And after 40 years, I can see a lot. I know what I'm looking for. Sure. And 80% of them, boom, they're out of there. The short stride, ugly stride, dangerous stride, all kinds of, they do the most stuff. I could show you pictures you would not believe that are not rare, that are typical of what these horses do. Then you think, oh my God, you don't want to own that horse for a lot of money. So, 80% are gone. But I've looked at 1,200. Now I've got 20%. So I've got, 250 left or something like that. So now I have to go out. I also have to think about whether I can sell the horse to somebody. If it really has absolutely no pedigree, even if it does well, its residual value for breeding isn't worth much. So my clients probably don't want it. So I can go through the pedigree at that point and say, well, the market isn't going to let me buy these. So maybe now I'm down at 200.
So even if they were horses that would win, can you build a pedigree from somebody who wasn't?
On a filly, you can if they're spectacular, but on a colt, you really can't. If it's got nothing sire and nothing dam, and it wins the Kentucky Derby, people do not pay a lot of money for it.
What if it won all three, like a?
Doesn't matter. It's closed. It's it's fighting City Hall
that way, or
I'm the disruptor. Remember, I'm not.
Sure.
I'm not mainstream.
Well, I know. I'm just curious. Like, does DNA like they say
we do DNA now? I am doing DNA now.
Comes from,
but I'll get to that in a minute.
So, like they say, male pattern baldness comes from the mom side of the family, right? Is there certain traits that just come from the mom side of the family that like they don't really care who the dad?
I'm going to get into DNA in a minute. But anyway, I get down at 200 horses, and then I send out my secret weapon, Patty Miller, that's like a phenomenal horse whisperer, rider, manager, everything. Unbelievable eye. The human brain is capable of really seeing sophisticated pattern recognition in a way that AI really can't yet match. Anyway, so she knows what to look for. So she goes out there, and they bring the horse out, and they walk it up and down and stand in front of her. And that gets rid of more than half of them, and more like 2/3 of them. So now I'm down to 60 horses, right? Now I start looking at their vet records and stuff that are on file, where there's x-rays on file, there's this, that. This guy's got a chip, that guy's got something wrong. This one had screws and wires, so his legs would look straight, but he wasn't born that way. And so now you get down, after she gets through looking them all, maybe I'm down to 3%. So what's 3% of 1,000? 30 horses or something.
Yeah.
Now I got to go out and I got to do actually, it's not even that good. It's down to 50. She's got to go out there. We go out there with an ultrasound machine that we developed. We were the first one to build the ultrasound that was portable, so you could go into a stall and do echo ultrasound on a heart. Before that, you had to go to a huge machine at a hospital. And we built that. We did the machine coding and adapted an Apple IIc. And then we started building databases. So we go out and we look at the size and the efficiency of their heart and the muscle and their spleen. That's another thing. Blood doping. The Russians had a blood doping scandal where they would inject themselves with extra red blood cells before the race. The horses can, when they get excited in the starting gate, they can squeeze their spleen and add 50% more actually to the red blood cells. So they blood dope themselves naturally. So we said, let's check how big the spleen is. And some of them much bigger. So they're better blood dopers. Anyway, so then we go out, we check their lungs and their spleens and their hearts and their muscles, this and that. And if they pass all that, then we go and do we look down their throats with an endoscope exam, because the longest nerve in nature is the recurrent laryngeal nerve in a horse. It goes from the base of their brain down to all the big neck, and then it's called recurrent because it loops back up to their larynx. And in a lot of horses, it becomes dysfunctional and they can't breathe. Their larynx and their epiglottis and the whole thing doesn't work right. And they end up, when they get excited, the whole closes off their airway. And you're screwed. They stop or they slow down. And that's very common. So we have to go looking for that. And at least half the horses that we've just spent all that time identifying fail right there. And then when we're all done, then we look at the pedigree and say, okay, how much is this going to cost and who the hell would buy it? And sometimes it's $2 million and sometimes it's $10,000. We have bought horses that won, the biggest races in the world, more than once for $20,000. We've also bought horses that won all these races that were $700,000 or baby. And, but we know people say, well, with different clients, how do you separate who gets what? I say, it doesn't matter who gets what. Once they pass all that, it's identical probability of success. They can have whichever one they want, or I can give this one to this guy and that one to that guy. I have no idea which one's going to do better.
Right. The nurture side of it takes over and you have actual trainers.
Yeah. And the trainers and the jockey are critical. I've watched jockeys screw up horses so bad. They weigh 1,000 pounds. They're going 40 miles an hour. And if they clip those or they get stopped, they stop them in traffic or they do this. They just stopped 1,000 pounds and it has to start again. And it just doesn't work. Or they keep it where it can't run. It's in traffic and so it doesn't. And they get it so it's got dirt in its face the whole race. It's just, or other jockeys have phenomenal rides. They're not the best horse in the race, but they give it every single advantage. And so it wins anyway. Calvin Burrell, when he won with 50-1 shot, Mind That Bird, most incredible ride. That's what won the race. He saved ground. He just did everything right. That horse it was the perfect trip. And it wasn't probably the best horse in the race.
Right. That's so fascinating. Something else that you mentioned in here was like the traditional expertise overlaid with tech. I see that happening a lot in the world today with AI, which you mentioned a little bit. But I think it's that there's a lot of people who are worried about it being disruptive, that these technologies are going to come in and disrupt their lives. And I think what's fascinating is that, at least so far, the technology without somebody to program it, the technology without somebody to know how to ask it what to do, is really useless. Like AI from a marketing or sales or whatever perspective, it's not super helpful unless you know how to prompt it, which means asking it for the right data. And if you know how to prompt it properly and be specific, then you probably know how to do it all by yourself. You just would rather have the assistance of technology than not have the assistance.
Ever feel like your heart just can't take seeing so many homeless pets? The Animal Alliance understands your pain. We're on a mission to spay and neuter to reduce overpopulation and prevent the heartache. Visit theanimalalliance.org to support our efforts.
I know
it's absolutely true. You can take all the data you want. You can measure the sock height of the boxers. It's not going to tell you who's going to win the race. That's what a lot of these guys do. They just get data all over the place. They don't know. That was the biggest breakthrough for us, was to accept that until we were the best at traditional expertise, we really didn't have much to add on to it. It wasn't going to work. If you don't do the basics right, forget it. And how many people are really virtuosos at the basics? Not many. So Patty Miller was the difference. When we got her and when we were working from her and then on, when we were asking, she was showing us and we were asking questions of her. When we worked with a world champion Olympic eventing thing, and we would ask him questions, he would say, well, you have to balance the horse on the bit. Now, there's a little piece of metal in their mouth, and it's a 1,000-pound animal, and it ain't balancing on that little piece of metal in its mouth. Mm-hmm. So he doesn't know what the hell he's doing, but he knows it's important, whatever he's doing. So he would tell us, and then we had to figure out, what the hell is he doing when he says he's balancing the horse on the bit? So then we were asking the right questions with the heart. There were all kinds of things they were doing wrong, measuring the heart, so they thought it wasn't working. But basically, that's because they were listening to the theoreticians, and nobody went out. I went out and got the hearts from the cadavers. We just did the research And we worked with the vets, and then we worked with the trainers, and we ended up asking the right questions. Now in DNA, they're marketing DNA markers now in sports racing, and they have what they call speed gene. It's big, popular, marketed, mass marketed. And it started out with 179 horses with one trainer in Ireland. And they found this marker. And I thought that is idiotic for a number of reasons. Number one is DNA, what gets expressed and how it gets expressed is enormously dependent on the environment and one stable in one place. And there's all this RNA and there's all this stuff they used to think was junk DNA that turns out to be really important. And what's turned off and what's turned off, and they work together. So it was silly. So and speed, a successful racehorse, when they're taking all the DNA from these big strand racehorses, there's many ways that they're successful. There are different combinations of variables, and it's like having a health gene, having a speed gene. It's ridiculous. It's too broad. So by the time we started the DNA, we had all the data on things we knew were predictive. The thickness of the wall of the left ventricle of the heart, the diameter of the spleen, things like that. The certain variables in the quadruped locomotion timing and the coordination, we knew they were important. So we had an enormous database of it, so we could go back and see, can we find markers for those, like getting a marker for breast cancer, a marker for Lou Gehrig's disease, not a marker for not being diseased, not for good health. And so that's what we're doing now. And if we just set AI on all the DNA for all the great racehorses, I think it can grind away forever. But it's just, it's like they'll end up with looking at, like I say, the sock height of boxers. It's meaningless.
It sounds like Patty, is that her name?
Yes, Patty.
So it sounds like she was a big help in identifying what data was important and what data wasn't. But also, when you have just like tons and tons of data, that's an issue that people run into, is they don't know what is important. So you have somebody tracking. Again, I help people with their money, and people will track their money. They'll write it all down on a spreadsheet, but they don't know how to interpret it. They don't know what it means. They don't know how to read the data. And so having data is just useless, really, if you don't know.
I got another example of that. The daily racing form has a bazillion statistics on the trainers, the jockeys, the horses, the races, the splits. It's enormous. You think you could just feed it all in and it'll tell you who the good horses are, but it won't. So my Patty Miller in that area is one of the most famous handicappers in the United States. A guy named Michael Kipnis. He's known as Wizard. His website is wizardracingsports.com, and we worked with him. And he helped us understand that looking at all the race data, what's important and what isn't, and what you got to look back at and what you don't, what it means. And so that was also a big deal, having him around. One of the best, he was one of the first people to design quantitative way of ranking races horses ran. So if they ran a different distance, a different racetrack, different horses, you could compare the races for their ability. And he kind of was one of the main creators of that approach. And he's just so good. And so we work closely with him as well. And that helps us understand our competitors and our own horses, what the hell's going on in these races. Because I'm telling you, when a horse comes out of a race, and then everybody will give you a big, long story about what happened. And most of it is just bullshit. It really is. He didn't like the grass, or he did this, or he doesn't love it, blah, blah. He got caught. I had some of these horses, they run the identical fatigue curve in like 5 races in a row. Exactly the same time and rate of slowing down. Exactly the same. And yet they'll tell you that the jockey did this and this one, and that happened, and he got cut off in this one. It's exactly the same race. It doesn't matter, but they don't know it. They don't know it. So they make changes based on stuff that's not true, and they're putting on blinkers, and they're doing this, and they're going longer, and it's all based on nothing.
So with so far we've talked about when you say getting into horse racing, my interpretation of that so far has been, if you want to invest in a horse, if you wanted to get into being a racer or whatever, I don't know any of that, but how much of this, with this data, do you bet on yourself, or do you feed to somebody so they can make bets based off of your data?
Yes. Yes,
Like how much, and what's because that was kind of what it seems like the first lawyer book that you were invited to study from your professor was about horse racing and the betting side of it. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe was more expansive than that. But like how much of it was, how much of what you're doing right now influences and feeds into the betting side of the conversation?
All of it. It's extremely important because it's another revenue stream in a tough business. It's not one you want to ignore. And yeah, they're a real opportunity. When horses are stretching out like the Belmont Stakes, distances they'd never run, the fatigue curves will pick out the long shots. Like the year before, the Arcangelo won. It was a 17-1. We were all over it. We knew he could go the distance and do that. They made a lot of money. And same thing with the Kentucky Derby. A lot of them never run the Gallantlet Quarter. So the fatigue curves will pick out the long shots reliably. And when they're running their first race, since we've seen all these horses at all the auctions, the yearlings, 2-year-olds, all this data, we know who the monsters are. And so we can feed that to Wiz and say, hey, Wiz, we saw this horse is in first race at Aqueduct. He's running his first. We saw him, and I'm telling you, man, he's got the goods. So
is it even... I know these are weird questions, but like, is it even betting if you have that much data, or is it investing at this point? Because you know that if you place,
Wiz makes a living. He makes his living gambling, and he's been doing it for a while. Well, so I guess at that level, it's investing because if you know what you're doing, it lowers the risk. But let me just say it this way: horse racing is kind of like having a yacht. And you got basic. If you're not very good and you don't know what you're doing, you probably buy an expensive yacht. It'll sit in the slip a lot, and you won't get to use it much, and it'll cost you a lot of money. If you really know what you're doing, you may get a bargain, and you'll probably figure out ways to not have it. Have a lot of fun with that boat, and not have it cost you as anywhere near as much money, but it's still going to cost you some money. And in each one of those yachts. In horse racing, there's a lottery ticket that you can make an enormous amount of money. So if you're going to just buy one, you're going to spend $40,000, $50,000 on a horse. You're going to spend $4,000 a month to keep it. Your chance, you're buying a lottery ticket. But if you're doing like what we did for Zayat Stables, in 3 years they went from nothing, from starting to being the most successful stable in the United States, spending a fraction of what their major competitors spent. Then he would invest $20 million a year. He got up to about $40 million at a time, and when he left, he had $64 million. He had problems in his other businesses that finished him off. It wasn't us. It wasn't our fault. And so, yeah, I think if you're gonna buy a professional team, it's an investment if you have the right people. I've seen plenty of people think they can buy the sport. They made a ton of money. They wanted to do it, and they get the trainer to buy all the horses and they just blow through, I don't know how many millions, and they get pissed off and they leave. That happens a lot, but it doesn't happen to our clients.
But it's gambling from probably a traditional word sense. This is like movies and stuff that I've experienced. I don't gamble at all. I've never have done it that way, but you can go bet on horse races. Does a lay person who's in Vegas, betting on horse races, sitting there watching the horse races, do they have any chance based on your data or getting your data and saying, hey, on this horse race, here are the odds, the odds based on the horses, not the odds based on what we all think is going to happen or pedigree or whatever, but like based on science and our technology and our review of all these horses, this is who we think is going to win most of the time? Or is that just something you guys have?
No, we're not the only guys. There's professional handicappers, not many, big ones, whales, some of whom do very well. Most of them don't. I mean, the majority of them lose money. You have to hope that they don't bet over their head and that they're actually enjoying themselves, so it's worth it. But it's not untrue that there are guys out there who do well at it.
Well, like I know there's a lot of people in a different industry. They call it options trading, right? So you maybe have heard of options trading or Forex trading or these different trading, but it's really just gambling, I think, for most people. They have no idea what they're actually looking at. They don't know what the real markers are. They don't know the market trends. They don't know what a tweet is going to do to which company and when and how long. And they don't know any of that because they don't actually know the trends. And when I've talked to people who are very good at that, making hundreds of millions of dollars a year trading, when they try and explain to me how they know what trades to take and what not trades to take, they're like, well, pretty much this. Except for here. And at the end of the day, it really comes down to kind of like what you're saying, like there is a high level of intuition. Do they know all the technical stuff? Do they understand the traditional expertise? Yes. But they also have just like an underlying intuition towards or natural ability to understand what is going on, and it just comes easy to them to see the numbers and see what.
Well, maybe they have a lot of expertise in forming those emotions.
Sure,
so that's pretty important. Yeah, and that's not to be discounted. Although in there and in the horse, of course, luck plays a part, and intuition. I mean, there's a couple of horses we bought because we thought they were dominant animals. We observed their behavior and we realized that they would rather drop dead than not be first, or they were going to kill a horse next to them that didn't get out of their way. And those are usually really good racehorses because they're all no free agents. They don't all try hard. And so when you find a horse like that, you have to pay real special attention. There was one champion filly we bought. We bought her as a yearling. And she was out in the field with like 50 yearlings in Kentucky. And when we got there and it was feeding time, they're all coming to the gate. And they're all crowded around the gate to come in. And then the Red Sea parts and she walks through. I thought, whoa, that's a dominant animal. She became named Madcap Escapade, and she was a champion. She was something else.
That's awesome.
And I'll tell you another story like that. I was like 40 years ago, I was at Hialeah when it was its glory days, when they had velvet couches in the grandstand, life-size bronze statues of Secretariat and Citation and things. And Citation, Secretariat wasn't there yet. Anyway, there was a nothing race. Usually in those races, at the end of the race, the horses are stretched out from the finish line. The guy who's last is all the way back at the 8th pole or something, eighth of a mile away, and all the way along horses. And a collie, got out onto the racetrack and chased them up the stretch. And when they got to the finish line, they were all a tight little bunch. You could have thrown a blanket over all of them. And I never forgot. I thought, my God, that's what happens when they're all trying. I never forgot that.
Yeah, what it would look like if they all actually did their best. So with this experience, I studied when I was I know this is going to take a seemingly strange left turn, but I feel like you might have more data than anybody else on this at this point that I know. I did my research paper, not on the same area of horses that you did, but I studied like equine therapy from a perspective of I studied neuropsychology in college. So the impact of the horse's heart and the ability to help individuals through cross patterning and things on a horse. But I'm curious, what did you or if you discovered anything, or if you tracked it, the energy field of horses' hearts, and like how much they're able to put out and benefit the jockeys, or what that relationship was like with the jockey.
I know that the relationship between the jockey and the horse can be critical. There was a famous jockey who was phenomenal, and he clearly had relationships with the horses. And he got them. He kind of would figure out what was their best lick, so they were the most efficient, and it got them to trust him and want to try and listen to him when he had to steer. His name was Steve Coffin. It's kind of legendary, and clearly there was something going on mentally between him and horses. And I wouldn't discount that. The horses are very, very sensitive. They know when there's a thunderstorm or earthquake coming before anybody else does. They're so sensitive. If you're trying to get a horse through a gate in a farm, and the help loses their temper, and they slam the horse with the gate because they're in a hurry, that horse you'll have trouble getting that horse through a gate for the rest of its life unless somebody really works with it hard. And it's there. I went to one horse I was thinking about buying, and turned into a very, very good racehorse. And before I brought him to your side, I stood in front of the stall. I wanted to see like what vibes I got. And I closed my eyes and I tried to be sensitive. And what I got was, "What are you looking at?" I thought, perfect, perfect. And he was perfect. His name was Pinky. I named him Pinky Piswanski. Fun name and a fun horse.
That's fun.
So I think that I think they have a soul. I think if you can touch them and you can communicate with it, you're going to make a difference. I know that physically their hearts are very different. The champions, their hearts are stronger. They're a better quality muscle. They're denser mitochondrial, producing energy. Their ejection fractions are, regular and strong. They don't have any malfunction of the mitral valve reflux or any of that stuff. They're different. They're different physically. In terms of, they're also so sensitive. If you give a horse a little shock, you can stop its heart and it'll die. It doesn't take much. It's that they're kind of like dogs. Dogs can see into infrared. They can hear into ultrasound. They can smell into a couple of molecules, right? They're so wired into reality in a way like maybe a Zen master would know something about, but the rest of us are clueless. And they're living in a different reality. And it shapes I can't believe it doesn't shape their performance.
Yeah, I wonder what okay, so this is what it is. I was just checking online to make sure I'm using proper terminology. So, because it's been like almost a decade since I studied this stuff in detail, but the horse's heart. So what I was really studying when I was in college was this idea of like, what is the best therapy animal? Like we use dogs for therapy, but like, what if you were raised somewhere where dogs were not a predominant animal, like in Africa or somewhere where there's just not a lot of dogs that are around? Like, would that population still feel most comforted by a dog, or would they choose a different animal that they're more used to? And so I was studying that, and it led into that statistically, like from a measuring perspective, horses they're generally going to emit more oxytocin than any other body, like any other animal. The horse's heart emits more of that hormone than any other animal, and so it can serve as a capacity to calm somebody down more. Like it's a better therapy animal. It's not necessarily the best because it's a giant animal. It's 1,000 pounds, right? So it's
but if you get it, they have therapy horses for kids that are handicapped, for retarded kids, taking care of horses for inmates where they learn take care of the horse, but it's more than learning to take care of the horse. They develop relationships with them and the animals. They are used as therapy animals very effectively in those settings. And they have, they say the outside of a horse is good for the inside of a man. They have profound effects on all kinds of levels of people.
Yeah, like I've been there, and I went to a bunch of these different therapy places across Utah. That's where I was doing my thesis at. But what was fascinating was their ability to really understand your emotion and feel and read your emotion. So if you were upset, or if you had recently lied to somebody, because they were dealing with these children who had RADS, which is reactive attachment disorder, in their family. So like they didn't understand proper communication or love, or they were always trying to deceive. And the horses, I mean, they'd obviously been trained for this purpose for therapy, but it was insane how they could tell, like if that child was living duplicitous or had just gotten an argument or hadn't resolved their conflict inside themselves, then the horse would be very standoffish. It wouldn't associate. And then as soon as that person would confess or share, get what they had off their chest, or go say sorry, whatever, then the horse would come up and kind of like give it a hug, stick its head over the kid. Like it was insane to watch. And this was not just one time, it was over and over and over and over.
That's been my experience as well. If you're tense, the horse is tense. They absolutely, there's that communication and that understanding. And I did this because I loved horses. I live on a horse farm. I love the scream of the baby horses when they were out there in the fields. And the deer, the fawns will meet the baby horses nose to nose. And that's why I do this. That's what keeps me alive. And people are in horse racing. They say, it's up, it's down, and it can be awful. And, they can lose lots of money. They can get hurt. They can't stop. It's their lives. It is addictive. The bond with horses is definitely real and very strong for many people. And if you get into horse racing, it isn't don't do it just about the money, because you'll miss half the joy and the excitement of it, because the horses are wonderful. They're wonderful to be around and work with, and they will, they're not dumb. They're not just a machine. They will know who you are.
Yeah, it's insane. Well, I'm so grateful for this conversation. I've learned way more than I ever thought I would needed to know about horse racing. And more importantly, I got some really good nuggets about things that I think will apply to other areas of business. We are up against the clock. If somebody wanted to learn more about your practice, what you're doing, or maybe wants to get involved in horse racing, where would they go to interact with you or your business?
Well, we have a website, www.eqb for equine biometrics .fyi. It's not .com, it's .fyi. Or if you want to know about the wagering end and that kind of stuff, call Wizard, our guy Michael Kipnis. He's wizardracingsports.com. And there's phone numbers there, and we're happy to talk to you. Our cell phones are there, our emails are there, and if you want more information, we'll direct you to there are all kinds of public sources on the internet where you can get accurate information and references. So you don't just have to believe all the experts that were right once and give you a big bullshit line.
Hey, well, that's what's so cool, is that there's people like you out there sharing, like, hey, this is our method, and our method's working. Here's our track record of our method. Yeah, it took a long time to get there, but I think most successes, once you figure out the equation, it's quickly and easily duplicated. Discovering the equation is the part that takes the most time. And that's true about anything in life. And rather than being upset about the discovery, find something to discover equation and something that you enjoy the whole entire process, and you love the process of discovery.
Yeah, and I think that's the key to discovery. I always ask you, when they tell you how it all works, ask, how do you know? Maybe they don't. Maybe you're going to have to figure it out for yourself.
Yeah, even for yourself, if you have something that you think ask yourself, how do I know this? Is this something I believe? Is this something I just heard from somebody else who told me this? Why do I believe this? And those are good questions to ask to help guide yourself into a happier future, I think, long term, because you can get rid of a lot of crap, false beliefs, false limiting beliefs that when you come down to it, they're not true and nobody knows. So, hey, well, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Jeff. Any final words before we head off?
No, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here and say again, I did it because I love horses. I love horse racing. If you're careful, it can be a hell of a lot of fun and even make some money.
Awesome. I love it. Thank you so much. And we'll catch you guys next time on the Fuel Your Legacy show.
Do you wish there was fewer pets in shelters tugging at your heartstrings? The Animal Alliance is on it. We're spaying and neutering to ensure fewer pets are born into a life of suffering. Visit the Animal Alliance to help us save our bleeding hearts.
Thanks for joining us. If what you heard today resonates with you, please like, comment, and share on social media. Tag me, and if you do give me a shout out, I'll give you a shout out on the next episode. Thanks to all of those who've left a review. It helps spread the message of what it takes to build a legacy that lasts. And we'll catch you next time on Fuel Your Legacy.